She set the cup on the table so quietly, I almost missed it. That was the first thing I remembered later. Not the words. Not even the look on her face. Just the sound that barely happened. Ceramic touching wood without force, like she had already practiced the motion and knew exactly how steady her hand needed to be. I was standing by the kitchen counter in our Portland house, one hand still resting near the coffee pot, looking at the steam lift from my mug. Outside, the morning was gray in that flat, familiar way it got before rain. Inside, everything looked ordinary enough to fool a man who wanted to be fooled. Her bag by the chair. My work boots by the back door. The faint smell of toast still hanging in the air. Then she said, "I met someone. I'm leaving." I didn't react right away. My mind heard the sentence, but something in me refused to give it meaning. I looked at her hands instead. They were resting near the cup. Calm. Still. No shaking. No second thoughts. No sign that she hated herself for saying it. That was when I understood this wasn't emotion. It was a decision. I finally looked up at her face, waiting for something to crack. Regret. Fear. Shame. Anything human enough to grab onto. She gave me none of it. Then, almost like she was adding a detail I needed to know for practical reasons, she said, "You won't recover without me." The room went very quiet after that. Quiet enough that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking wall clock over the stove. I remember thinking how strange it was that ordinary sounds could keep going when something had just ended. I didn't ask who he was. I didn't ask how long. I didn't ask why. I just stood there looking at her, and somewhere behind my ribs, something shut down cleanly. No drama. No heat. Just a switch thrown in the dark. In that moment, before I said a single word, I think I stopped being her husband. A month before she said it, our life still had the shape of something solid. That was the dangerous part. Not that things were perfect. They weren't. It was that everything still looked close enough to normal that I could keep explaining it to myself. Portland mornings, damp air coming in through the window screen, 2 pairs of running shoes by the door, her making coffee while I checked weather for a job site. Shared dinners when our schedules lined up. Quiet nights on the couch with one of us half paying attention to whatever show was on and the other answering emails. Ordinary habits. Ordinary routines. The kind that make you believe a life is holding. Megan worked in marketing for a wellness brand that seemed to rebrand itself every 6 months. New campaigns, new retreats, new language for old products. She was good at it too. Sharp, polished, always 2 steps ahead in a room. I was building my construction business the slower way, 1 crew, 1 contract, 1 reputation at a time. Most weeks I left the house before 7 and came home carrying dust in the seams of my clothes and numbers in my head. For a long time, I thought that difference had made us stronger. She had known me before things steadied out, before the business had real accounts, before my name meant anything in town. She had seen the years I don't talk about much, the rehab stays, the relapses, the starts that didn't hold, the look people get when they care about you but no longer trust what you say. 9 years clean now, but back then every month felt borrowed. Megan had been there through that. Not perfectly, not like some saint, but she had stayed when staying cost something. I built a lot of my faith in our marriage on that fact. Maybe too much. I thought surviving the worst version of my life with someone meant you had built something that couldn't be replaced by mood or boredom or attention from the right stranger. So when she started changing, I reached for kinder explanations. At first it came as distance, so minor it was easy to dismiss. More weekends away for retreats. More evenings where she came home with that drained, unreachable look and said she didn't want to talk about work. She stopped asking how my day went unless I had already started answering. Eye contact got shorter. Touch became functional. A hand on my shoulder while passing behind me. A quick kiss that landed and disappeared before it meant anything. I noticed all of it. I just refused to name it. Stress, I told myself. Burnout. Maybe she needed space. Maybe I was too buried in work. Maybe this was what marriages look like sometimes when people got tired at the same time in different ways. It is embarrassing, looking back, how hard a man can work to protect the lie he prefers. Her words that morning didn't feel impulsive. That was the part that stayed with me once the initial silence settled. There was no hesitation in her voice, no searching for language. She didn't circle around it or soften it. She delivered it clean, like something she had already repeated to herself enough times that it no longer carried weight. People don't speak like that unless they've already left in their head. After she walked out of the kitchen, I stayed where I was for a while, not thinking in any dramatic sense, just sorting. Small details began to come back, not as memories tied to emotion, but as fragments lining up in a way they hadn't before. Her phone, for one. It used to sit anywhere, countertops, nightstand, the edge of the sink while she got ready. Lately it had a place, always face down, always within reach. Conversations that ended when I walked into the room. Not abruptly enough to accuse, just consistently enough to register. Then there were the shifts in routine. She had started waking earlier on certain days, not for work, but for calls. Quiet ones. She would take them in the other room, voice lowered, pacing slightly. When she came back, she would act like nothing had happened, but her energy was different. Focused. Directed somewhere that wasn't inside this house. I remembered the retreats. Sedona came up more than once. At the time it sounded like branding language, something her company would lean into. Wellness, reset, alignment. Words that meant a lot in her field and very little in mine. That was where the name first appeared. Noah. It came casually, almost as a side note in a story she didn't finish. There's this instructor, Noah. He's been leading some of the sessions. No emphasis. No explanation. Just enough to exist, not enough to question. I didn't question it then. I do now. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. Because once her sentence settled in my head, I met someone. Everything reorganized itself around that missing center. The timing made sense. The distance. The way her attention had shifted from shared space to something parallel. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was structure. And the more I looked at it, the cleaner it became. I didn't feel panic. That surprised me. There was no rush of anger, no immediate need to confront or demand answers. What I felt instead was a kind of clarity I hadn't experienced in a long time. Like standing over a set of plans after weeks of confusion and finally seeing how all the measurements connect. The pieces had been there. I had just been choosing not to assemble them. By the time I finished my coffee, the story had already changed shape. Not emotionally. Practically. There was me. There was her. And there was everything in between that no longer belonged to both of us. I didn't ask her any questions that morning. No why. No how long. No attempt to negotiate something that had already been decided without me. She stood there long enough to see if I would react, maybe waiting for something louder, something she could push against. I gave her nothing. That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. She picked up her bag, said something about staying somewhere else for a few days, and left the house with the same controlled movements she had used when placing the cup down. The door closed softly behind her. No slam. No final punctuation. Just absence. I stayed in the kitchen a while longer, finishing the coffee I had already poured. It had gone lukewarm, but I drank it anyway. There was something steadying about not changing course mid-action. After that, I moved through the house once, slowly. Not looking for anything specific. Just seeing it clearly. The couch where we used to sit without phones between us. The hallway where her shoes lined up in a way that suggested she still lived here, even if she had already stepped out of it. The bedroom, still made, still carrying the outline of a life that had technically existed the night before. There was no dramatic moment in it. No single object that triggered anything sharp. It was more like walking through a place that had already been emptied, even though everything was still in it. By early afternoon, I started making calls. 2 people. Both friends I trusted enough not to ask unnecessary questions. I told them I'd be leaving town for a while. Not running. Not disappearing. Just relocating. Boise came up because one of them had a connection there, a small contractor looking to offload some work. It made sense in a practical way, which was enough. I packed that evening. Not everything. Just what belonged to me without discussion. Tools, clothes, documents. A few personal things that didn't carry weight beyond usefulness. I left the rest exactly where it was. There was no need to divide anything yet. That could happen later, through channels that didn't require conversation. By the next morning, the truck was loaded. I walked through the house one last time, turned off what needed to be turned off, and left the key on the counter near the same cup she had placed there. No note. No message. Nothing that suggested I was waiting for a response. The drive to Boise was quiet. I didn't put on music. Didn't call anyone. The road gave me enough to focus on. Mile markers, fuel stops, the steady repetition of distance creating space where there hadn't been any. Somewhere along the way, It settled into something simple. I wasn't leaving because she asked me to. I was leaving because there was nothing left there that required me to stay. And for the first time in a long while, the decision felt like it belonged entirely to me. Boise gave me something Portland hadn't in a while. Silence that didn't belong to anyone else. The place I rented was temporary, same as everything else at that point. A small house on the edge of a developing area, unfinished sidewalks, fresh lumber stacked at nearby sites. The kind of place where things were still being built instead of remembered. It suited me. There was no history in it. No shared routines, trying to continue out of habit. I started working almost immediately. The contractor my friend connected me with didn't ask for much beyond reliability. That was enough. I took on more than I needed to at first. Long days, physical work, numbers at night. It wasn't about money as much as it was about structure. A way to move forward without having to define what forward meant yet. Mornings, I ran. Not far at first. Just enough to keep the rhythm. Pavement instead of trails, new streets without landmarks tied to memory. Evenings, I trained at a local gym. Same idea. Repetition. Control. Small, measurable progress that didn't require interpretation. I kept my phone quiet. Megan reached out once during the first week. A short message. We need to talk. I read it, then set the phone down and went back to what I was doing. There wasn't anything left to clarify. Whatever conversation she wanted belonged to a version of me that had stayed. At night, sometimes, I went back through old messages. Not often, and not for long. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for pattern. Dates, tone shifts, gaps in communication that lined up with what I now understood. It was the same process I used on job timelines when something didn't add up. Trace it back, find where the deviation started, see how far it spread. It was all there. Gradual. Consistent. Nothing dramatic enough to force a confrontation at the time. Just enough, over enough time, to build a second track alongside the first. A couple weeks in, I noticed she had started posting again. Photos from trips, landscapes, clean light, controlled angles. The kind of images that suggest a life without friction. It didn't take long before he appeared in them. Noah. Not tagged directly at first. Just present. A reflection in glass. A figure slightly out of focus in the background. Then clearer. Standing beside her. Both of them positioned like they belonged in the same frame. He looked exactly how I would have expected. Composed. Balanced. The kind of confidence that comes from being seen a certain way for a long time. There was nothing obviously wrong with him. Nothing exaggerated. If anything, that was the point. Everything about it felt finished. Too finished. The smiles. The timing of the posts. The consistency of the setting. It all lined up a little too cleanly, like something curated instead of lived. That was the first thing that didn't sit right. Not emotionally. Structurally. The idea came without urgency. It wasn't driven by anger or a need to interfere. If anything, it came from the same place the rest of my decisions had been coming from lately, clarity. A loose thread that didn't match the rest of the structure tends to stand out when everything else is quiet. Noah. I didn't care about him in a personal sense. He wasn't part of my life. But he had become part of a situation that used to be mine, and the way things presented themselves didn't align cleanly. The more I looked at it, the more it felt constructed. Not false exactly. Just incomplete. So I decided to verify. A few weeks after settling into Boise, I contacted a private investigator. Not a dramatic move, just a practical one. I didn't frame it as jealousy or suspicion. I gave him names, locations, a general timeline, and asked for basic confirmation. Background, current status, anything that didn't match the surface. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. Work like that tends to move quietly when it's done right. A few calls, public records, patterns pulled from places people assume no one is looking. It took less than 10 days for him to come back with something that mattered. Noah wasn't single. He was married. San Diego. A wife. No public indication of separation. No overlap in the narrative Megan was presenting through her posts. Clean, documented, verifiable. That was it. No complexity. No hidden layers beyond that. Just a fact that didn't belong in the version of the story they were living publicly. I read through the report once, then set it aside. There was no immediate reaction. No satisfaction. No sense of advantage. Just a confirmation that what had seemed slightly off actually was. I didn't contact Megan. Didn't ask her to explain it. Didn't offer her the opportunity to correct anything. That wasn't my role anymore. Whatever she had chosen to build, She could manage it on her own terms. But the information didn't belong to me alone. So I prepared it. Everything the investigator provided, documents, names, dates, I organized it into a single file. No commentary, no message attached, just facts, presented in a way that didn't require interpretation. Then I sent it. Not to Megan. To the other side. No return address. No explanation of who I was or why I had it. Just enough information for someone else to see what had been happening inside their own life. After that, I went back to work. The following days didn't feel different on the surface. Same schedule, same routines, same quiet structure I had been building since I left. But something had shifted. What had started as a private situation between two people no longer belonged only to them. And I had no interest in being part of whatever came next. She called a week later. I was finishing up at a job site just outside the city, going over measurements with a subcontractor before closing out for the day. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across unfinished framing, the kind of light that makes everything look more defined than it is. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Her name still showed up the same way it always had. No change there, just a label attached to something that no longer functioned the way it used to. I let it ring once more before answering. Yeah, there was a pause on the other end. Not hesitation, more like she was adjusting to the fact that I had actually picked up. When she spoke, her voice wasn't calm anymore. You sent something. Not a question. I leaned against the side of my truck, looking out over the site. I don't know what you're talking about. Another pause. Shorter this time. Don't do that, she said, sharper now. Don't pretend you don't know. You sent information to her. To his wife. I didn't respond right away. There was noise behind her. Not much. Just enough to suggest she wasn't where she expected to be a week ago. No background music, no ambient conversation. Just space. You had no right, she continued. Do you understand what you've done? I watched one of the crews loading up tools, moving in a rhythm that didn't require discussion. Simple. Direct. Finished for the day. I didn't do anything to you, I said. Her breath caught slightly, like she hadn't expected that answer. You ruined everything, she said. The control in her voice was gone now, replaced by something tighter. Everything we were building. I let that sit for a second. Then I asked, were you going to tell her? Silence. Not the kind that fills space. The kind that confirms something. That's not the point, she said finally, but it came out thinner. It is, I said. She exhaled hard, frustration pushing through now. You don't get to interfere in my life like that. You walked away. That was your choice. She was right about one part of that. I did walk away, but I hadn't stepped into anything new. I had stepped out of something that no longer held. I didn't interfere, I said. I passed along information that didn't belong to me. That's interference, she snapped. No, I said, keeping my voice even. That's correction. There was a longer silence this time. I could hear her breathing, uneven now, not controlled the way it had been that morning in the kitchen. Whatever structure she had built around this situation had started to shift, and she didn't have a clean way to stabilize it. You're trying to punish me, she said. No. The word came out without effort. I'm not doing anything to you. Then why, she pressed. Why would you do that if not to hurt me? I looked out at the site one more time, then reached for the truck door. You made your choice, I said. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't add anything to it. Just the statement. There was nothing on the other end for a second. No response ready. No angle to push from. I opened the door, paused just long enough to make sure she had heard it clearly. Then I hung up. No follow-up. No explanation. Nothing left open. After that call, things moved without me. That was the first clear difference. Before, even when things were strained, there was still a sense that whatever happened between us required my involvement. A conversation. A reaction. Some form of participation. Now it didn't. The divorce process started and finished the way most clean separations do when neither side tries to drag it out. Papers filed. Terms outlined. Assets divided without argument. We didn't meet in person for any of it. Everything went through attorneys, structured and efficient, like closing out a contract that had already stopped functioning. I signed where I needed to sign. So did she. There were no last-minute messages. No attempts to revisit anything. Whatever she had expected from me, anger, resistance, negotiation, it never came. And without that, there wasn't much for her to respond to. From what I understood, her situation didn't hold the way she thought it would. I didn't follow it closely. Didn't ask anyone for updates. But information travels in predictable ways, especially when it involves people who present their lives publicly. The photos stopped first, the consistent posts, the curated angles. Then the absence became noticeable. Noah disappeared from her pages entirely. No explanation attached. That was enough to tell me what I needed to know. On my end, things stayed simple. Work expanded faster than I expected. The contractor I started with began passing more responsibility my way. Larger sections of projects. Direct communication with clients. Within a few months, I wasn't just filling gaps anymore. I was building something new, under my own name again. Different market. Different people. No overlap with the past. I kept the same structure I had started with. Early mornings. Consistent runs. Training in the evenings. It wasn't about discipline for its own sake. It was about maintaining a pace that didn't leave room for unnecessary reflection. Not avoidance. Just direction. The people around me were different too. No shared history. No assumptions about who I had been before I got there. They knew me as I was presenting myself now. Reliable, focused, quiet. That was enough. Sometimes, on longer drives between sites, I would think about how quickly things had shifted. Not emotionally. Practically. A life that had taken years to build had closed out in a matter of weeks once the foundation underneath it stopped holding. There was no dramatic collapse. Just a series of adjustments that, once set in motion, didn't require further input from me. I didn't try to prove anything through any of it. Didn't try to show that I was doing better. Didn't compare outcomes. The only measurable difference that mattered was internal. I wasn't carrying anything forward that didn't belong to me. And that made everything else easier to build. At some point, I stopped replaying it. Not all at once. There wasn't a clear day where it ended. It just faded. The way a sound does when you move far enough away from it that you no longer notice when it disappears. For a while, I had gone back over that morning in the kitchen more than I needed to. Not emotionally, just structurally. The cup on the table, the way she stood, the exact tone she used when she said she was leaving. Her certainty, the absence of hesitation. It had felt important to understand it correctly. But over time, the need for that accuracy went away. There wasn't anything left in it that required analysis. I didn't think about who was right. Didn't weigh actions against outcomes. Didn't measure what I could have done differently or what she should have handled another way. That kind of thinking assumes there's something to recover or repair. There wasn't. What existed between us had already ended before it was said out loud. The conversation in the kitchen was just the formal version of something that had been developing quietly for longer than I had been willing to admit. Once I accepted that, everything else became straightforward. There were no arguments left to win. No version of the story that needed to be defended. Just a set of events that had already concluded. Her sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. You won't recover without me. At the time, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because there was nothing in me that needed to push back against it in that moment. She believed it. That was enough for her to say it out loud. But statements like that don't hold weight on their own. They depend on time. And time has a way of testing things without asking permission. Months passed. Work stabilized. Then grew. The routines I had built stopped feeling temporary and started feeling like a life again. Not the same one. Not a replacement. Just something that functioned on its own without referencing what came before. I didn't track her life. Didn't check updates. Didn't ask mutual contacts. Whatever was happening on her side stayed there. Separate. Unconnected. That separation mattered more than any explanation could have. Because recovery, as it turns out, doesn't announce itself. It shows up in smaller ways. In decisions that don't require hesitation. In days that pass without needing to be managed. In the absence of noise where there used to be constant adjustment. I never answered her statement. Not then. Not later. There was no need. The answer existed without being spoken. Sometimes I still remember that morning. Not often. And not in a way that pulls me back into it. It shows up the same way certain job sites do after you've finished them. Clear, complete, no longer active. The cup on the table. The way she said it without hesitation. The certainty behind her words. For a while, I thought that moment would carry weight longer than anything else. That it would stay fixed, like a reference point I'd keep coming back to whether I wanted to or not. It didn't. Time doesn't erase things. It just changes where they sit. That morning moved further back. Not buried. Not forgotten. Just placed where it belongs. A closed point in a timeline that kept going without needing to circle back. I never responded to what she said. Not in that moment. Not after. There was no message, no correction, no attempt to prove anything differently. I didn't need to argue with her version of me. I just stopped participating in it. Life didn't reset. It didn't return to anything familiar. It moved forward. Work, routine, new structures, new people, none of it dramatic, none of it forced. Just consistent, steady progress that didn't depend on what had been there before. And eventually, that became enough. Her voice, that sentence, the certainty behind it, it all lost its edge. Not because it was wrong or right, because it stopped matching. What stayed was simpler than that. I kept going. Without her. That's the end of this story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos on screen for you. Pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.